It's great to welcome to the program today Dr. Sophie Leroy, who is Associate Professor at the University of Washington, Bothell's School of Business. Great to speak to you today. I appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to be on your show.
So let's just start. When we talk about the idea of multitasking, does multitasking even really exist, or is it just switching between one task and another and working on each individually?
You're right. It actually does not fully exist. Like our brain cannot process two things at the same time. So what we do is actually we switch very quickly between two things or even more. So we feel like we're multitasking when in fact we're not. We're really, again, switching back and forth really, really fast.
So in these tests or studies that are sometimes done where someone is, for example, driving a car on a closed course and there are different obstacles that pop up and they're simultaneously being given simple or sometimes not so simple math problems over the phone.
Right.
It does seem as though you are both driving and solving the math problems at the same time. But in some sense, are you sort of putting the driving in an autopilot mode as you think about the math problems?
Yes, absolutely. And that's why, from a performance standpoint, this is really problematic, right? Because what it means is that when you do the math problem while you're driving, you're actually not focused on the road. You're not processing what's going on the road. And so you can miss cues, you can miss things that are happening. Your reaction time is delayed because you need something else to capture your attention very fast back on the road. And so when you're on the road and not doing your math problem, you're going to be slower at your math problem because you're actually not processing the math, right? So from a performance standpoint, there are many issues that comes into play due to the fact that because we're switching back and forth, there is a very small time period where you're actually not doing what you're supposed to do.
So when we think about how we might sort of do our work throughout the course of a day, and there is a lot of this, what some people might call multitasking, but is really switching between tasks back and forth. There's the term attention residue, which is an interesting term, which, if I understand correctly, relates to the way in which, as you switch between tasks, some of your attention is not fully there yet or is remaining on the prior task. Is that more or less what we mean when we say attention residue?
That's right. And so it's a little different from the multitasking aspect, right? So multitasking, you're trying to do two things at the same time, and your brain is switching back and forth between those two things. Attention residue is a little different in the sense where it occurs when we work on something and then we have to let it go and transition to something else. And in that case, our brain cannot do that either. We have a hard time transitioning because we have a hard time letting go of things that are incomplete. So attention residue does not necessarily occur all the time, but it occurs when we're not fully satisfied with what we've done, it's not finished, we were interrupted in the middle of that thought process. And as we transition, the brain does not want to let go. In part because we have a need for completion. And so those transitions or those interruptions are really frustrating our need for completion. And so the brain is going to hold on to it, process what's going on that task that we had to put aside. And so what happens is we have actually divided attention. Our brain, in fact, then multitask. Attention residue is a form of multitasking in the sense that it will go back to the task we were working on previously and then at the same time try to perform what we're supposed to do in the present. So it's a little different, right, in terms of what triggers it, but it's very relevant to the workplace as well, because as you think about how we work, right, oftentimes we have to go from meetings to the next. We're working on a project, boom, there's a phone call, for example, from a client or someone else passing by, a colleague who needs some information and is asking some questions, right? So we have to transition very frequently, and those transitions are just very, very hard for the brain to perform.
So when I interviewed Cal Newport a few weeks ago, who teaches computer science at Georgetown, I believe it is,
Mm-hmm.
he suggests this idea of planned deep work, right? Focusing on single intense tasks for long periods of time because you're reducing the number of those transitions that you're referring to. And you can be most sort of productive and thinking most deeply when you spend a long period of time focused on one thing. Of course, the practical issue seems to be that in more and more jobs, 20, 30, 40, even more than half of the job can basically be writing emails and switching to meetings and taking phone calls and those types of activities. So it seems like that is definitely the best ideal, but it seems very impractical for many modern jobs at this point in time.
Absolutely. And And that's actually where my what my research focused on is kind of assuming that we can't change our corporate cultures, that the need, kind of this need to get information right away, and kind of we have a sense of urgency, and that triggers a lot of those interruptions. Think about all the technologies that we have is facilitating all those interruptions. And so if we assume that those interruptions are going to stay, then how do we cope with this cognitively, right? So I'm going to go back to this idea that what is the brain in need for? What prevents the brain to transition, to move from one task to another, to move from deep work to deep work? Is this need for completion? And so what I found in my research is that when we're in a position where we are working on something, we are interrupted, is incomplete, we ask to move, we need to spend maybe a minute to create what I call the ready to resume plan. And so it's the same idea of planning, but it's a different implementation of it, which is you stop, you say, okay, what is it that I was doing? Where am I on my project? What is it that I want to do next when I return to it? So especially planning the return is critical for the brain to feel like, okay, I can let go because yes, it's not finished, but I have a plan that will allow me to complete. And so that sense of completion is not as threatened as it is when we just drop everything and switch. So this ready to resume plan, what I've shown is that it actually helps reduce attention residue on the next task. And as a result, performance on that next task actually increased tremendously. I tested it through different ways. It improves the quality of our processing in terms of processing of information. People are able to pay more attention. It improves the quality of a decision making that people engage in. It improves recall of information. So they have to recall information, thing that they've read. That also is improved. So what was really interesting is it was a less than a minute intervention, and that led to huge impact on attention and on performance.
Now, what did you learn about, so if you're writing something, for example, and you take a brief break to look at your email and respond to one email, and then you go right back to the writing, how long is the brain affected in terms of limited focus after what might be just 30 seconds to write an email?
It's actually it's huge. It's really surprising that how, I think it's counterintuitive for a lot of people, how just this very brief interruption would actually affects you when you come back, right? So the issue of switching in that case is you switch to something else, and what happens when you come back? Well, the brain basically has to remember where is it that you were, and what kind of thoughts you kind of, what was your train of thoughts, where you were going, and all of those things. By just switching away for a second, then it's going to take you a long time to remember where you were, to regain the same level of concentration, to remember where you were going. And so it doesn't really, obviously, the longer the interruption, the harder that switch back, the harder it is to switch back. But even small interruptions actually are detrimental. And so I think that's where, like, if you're writing something and you have to switch, even if it was just a few seconds, if you kind of put a couple ideas of what you wanted to write, but even, oftentimes people switch because they're kind of like, they don't know what to do next. They're not fully there, or they're bored, or it's kind of a hurdle, right? And so just write like, okay, I need to write about X. I don't know how to, but that's okay. And then you switch and then you return. Oh yeah, now I know it was about X.
That seems to me to be one of the most pernicious elements of the sort of modern task switching, availability of social media at any time that you want, because at some point in the past, if you are writing something and you have a very brief, momentary writer's block, for example, you think through it and maybe in 5 minutes you're past it. But it's so easy and it's so attractive to pick up your phone and look at Facebook or look at Twitter that even only 45 or 60 seconds later, you've now looked at, 30 different posts and thought about 30 different things. It actually seems like it will hinder you from getting past that writer's block in a way that maybe just sitting there quietly for 5 minutes would actually let you work through the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because it makes you busy with something else. And, there is some research that shows that when we let things incubate, we actually get new ideas. And so it's not that the issue is less about doing something else, but if that next task is very pulling, very engaging, and even social media, I know to some extent is, you don't have a cognitive space to actually answer your friends while at the same time think about the ideas that you were trying to express that were, or the problem you were trying to solve. And so um, we're not getting much by switching in that case from a pure creativity standpoint or problem solving standpoint. And so but it's tempting. It's easier. It feels good, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess given that it's just our phones and the apps and the internet platforms that we use are designed to keep our attention for as long as possible, how drastic do the measures need to be that one uses or employs to avoid those temptations and distractions? I mean, should you be disconnecting your computer from the internet if it's possible? Well, I mean, it's just not practical. Like when I'm preparing for my show, all of my source material is on the internet. So I can't
Yep.
literally disconnect from the internet, but I can put my phone in the other room, for example.
Yes. So there are a couple of thoughts, right? I agree. I think it's the more you block what is tempting, so it's going to be different things for different people. Um, I think the easier it is to not go there when you're faced with a challenge. Um, One thing that I, for example, do is I will look at the time and I said, okay, for the next 30 minutes, I am not touching anything.
Right.
Right. Now, there's something that happened to me that I think is interesting and also relevant to this kind of checking out or checking other devices. For the longest time, I would put my phone on vibrate so that I would not be interrupted. But then I realized that I would check it because just in case the kids call cold, for example, or just in case a colleague texts me and I felt like I needed to answer. And I realized that was actually forcing me to transition versus if I have it on volume, then I don't have to worry about it because I will hear it if someone wants to call me. Now, I have to tell you, not a lot of people call me during the day. So, right. So that's also, I know that I can leave that on volume and not be interrupted that much, but it completely removed all my checking behaviors because I know if someone wants to reach me, I will hear them. I don't have to worry about them. And so I allow myself then to have my phone with me. The other thing that I do is very much like you, I do a lot of, in terms of research, I have to be on the internet. And I'm going to tell myself, I am not going to check the news. I'm not going to check anything outside of work, even email for the next 2 hours. But that requires self-discipline. But the interesting part of it is I think it's discipline that we can learn. And we can train our attention not to crave for those, fast gratification through social media, for example. We can train our brain to stick with what we're doing for longer time periods, slowly. So that's where I think there's hope, but it depends on what we are willing to do and what our goals are.
Yeah, definitely. It seems like there's an element in this in which the brain is sort of like a muscle that can be strengthened, so to speak, to be better at maintaining attention for longer periods of time. We have been speaking with Dr. Sophie Leroy, who is an associate professor at the University of Washington, Bothell School of Business. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Oh, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.